The moment Louise Wells stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, she had exactly $4.32 in her coat pocket, a cast-iron skillet tied to her travel bag, and absolutely no intention of falling in love with anyone. She had come west for work, plain and simple. Not for romance, not for adventure, not for any of the gilded promises that Eastern newspapers printed about the frontier. She had come because her mother had died the previous winter, leaving behind nothing but a rented room in St. Louis and a stack of unpaid bills. And Louise, at 26 years of age, was practical enough to know that grief was a luxury she could not afford. She needed a wage. She needed a roof. She needed a purpose that got her out of bed before the sun made its demands on the day. The town of Caldwell was rough and loud and smelled heavily of cattle and horse, and the particular kind of dust that only the Kansas plains could manufacture. It sat right on the border with Indian Territory, and drovers pushed longhorn cattle through its main street with the casual authority of men who knew the land belonged to whoever could stand the heat long enough to claim it. Louise had heard it called the Border Queen of Kansas by a man on the stagecoach, and she had looked at the mud-rutted streets and the weathered storefronts, and thought that if this was a queen, the crown had seen better days. She did not say that out loud. Louise Wells had long since learned that the most useful skill a woman without money could develop was the ability to keep her sharper observations to herself. She found the posting nailed to the board outside the land office before she even found a place to wash her face. The paper was sun-bleached and curling at the corners, but the words were clear enough. Rafter E Ranch, 6 miles south of Caldwell. Seeking experienced cook for crew of 12 working cowboys. Wages paid monthly. Room and board included. Inquire at the Drover's Rest Hotel. Ask for Emmett Crane, foreman. Louise read it twice, then untied her skillet from her bag, tucked it under her arm like a proper credential, and went to find Emmett Crane. He was a short, wide-shouldered man in his 50s with a gray mustache that drooped past his chin and eyes that evaluated her the way a man evaluates a horse at auction, which is to say openly and without any particular apology. He sat at a corner table in the hotel dining room nursing a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold 20 minutes ago. "You the cook?" he asked, looking at the skillet. "I am, if you'll have me," Louise said, and sat down without being invited because she had learned that waiting to be invited was the fastest way to be overlooked. Emmett's eyebrow lifted slightly. "What's your experience?" "I cooked for a boarding house in St. Louis for 3 years. 40 men at peak capacity, breakfast, dinner, and supper. Before that, I cooked at a river hotel outside Memphis. I can work with an open fire, a wood stove, or a Dutch oven. I can stretch a pound of dried beans into enough soup to feed 20 men and make them feel grateful for it. I can bake cornbread without a leavening agent if I have to, and I can butcher a hog in under 2 hours. She folded her hands on the table. "Is there something specific you would like to know?" Emmett looked at her for a long moment. Then he drained his cold coffee, stood up, and said, "Wagon leaves at first light. Be at the livery by 5. That was how Louise Wells arrived at the Rafter E Ranch on a Tuesday morning in April 1878 with her skillet, her travel bag, 2 aprons, and the particular quiet determination of a woman who has decided that her circumstances do not define her ceiling. The ranch was larger than she expected. The main house sat on a low rise above a creek called Bitter Fork, which Emmett told her had gotten its name from the taste of the water during dry spells. There were bunkhouses for the hands, a barn that could hold 30 horses, a smokehouse, a well, and set off to the east side of the main house, a cook's kitchen that had been attached to the structure with the practical aesthetic of a building that had been added when necessity demanded and beauty was not consulted. The owner of the Rafter E was a man named Gerald Rafter, who was 63 years old, rarely left his chair on the porch, and communicated his needs primarily through Emmett. He nodded at Louise when Emmett introduced her, said, "Hope you're better than the last one," and went back to looking at the horizon as though it owed him an explanation. The kitchen was a good kitchen. Louise decided that immediately. It was cluttered and badly organized and smelled of rancid lard, and something she chose not to investigate too closely. But the wood stove was solid, the hearth was wide, the shelves were sturdy, and the back door opened toward the prevailing breeze. She spent the rest of Tuesday afternoon cleaning it, reorganizing the dry goods, taking stock of what was available, and making a list of what was needed. The Cowboys came in for supper that first night in groups of 2 and 3, loud and trail-dusty, and carrying the particular smell of men who have spent all day on horseback in the Kansas wind. They were a mixed assortment, as ranch crews tended to be in that era. Some young men fresh from the East chasing romantic notions of the open range. Some older seasoned hands who had been working cattle since before the war. A Mexican vaquero named Pedro who could rope anything that moved. And a lean, sun-darkened man from the Texas Panhandle named Dix who seemed to communicate exclusively through expressions of mild disapproval. Louise had prepared a proper meal for that first night despite the limited supplies she found waiting. She had made a thick beef and potato stew using the last of the fresh beef before it turned, cornbread baked in the skillet, and dried apple cobbler sweetened with the last of the molasses she found in the back of the pantry. She had set the long table in the dining room adjoining the kitchen with actual care, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she believed food deserved to be served with intention. The men sat down, and there was the usual noise of benches scraping and boots hitting the floor and tin cups being filled from the water pitcher, and then they tasted the stew, and the room went quiet in the specific way that rooms only go quiet when something has genuinely surprised the people in them. "Lord Almighty," said a red-headed young man named Cody, who could not have been more than 19 and looked it. "That is the best thing I have eaten since my mother's kitchen in Ohio." There was a general rumble of agreement. Pedro said something in Spanish that Louise did not fully catch but read in tone as deeply complimentary. Dix ate an entire second helping without changing his expression, which Emmett later told her was the highest possible praise from that particular man. Louise stood at the kitchen doorway and watched them eat with the satisfaction that good cooking has always given to people who know how to do it properly. The specific pleasure of nourishment freely given and honestly received. And that was when she first noticed Arthur Easton. He was sitting at the far end of the table, slightly apart from the others in the way that some men naturally separate themselves, not from unfriendliness but from a habit of observation. He was perhaps 29 or 30, tall even sitting down, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and hands that were large and weathered and wrapped around his tin cup with a gentleness that seemed slightly at odds with the rest of him. He had a strong jaw and dark eyes that, when they moved from his bowl to the kitchen doorway, found her immediately, as though he had known she was standing there all along. He did not say anything. He just looked at her with those steady dark eyes and gave a single, unhurried nod, and then went back to his food. Louise went back to her kitchen. She told herself it meant nothing, that nod. Men nodded at the cook the same way they nodded at the stable hand, out of basic acknowledgement, nothing more. She had not come to the Rafter E to be noticed by anyone in a way that complicated things. She had come to cook, to earn her wage, and to build something solid from the ground up. But the next morning, when she came into the kitchen before sunrise to light the stove and start the coffee, Arthur Easton was already there. He was sitting on the low wooden stool near the back door, not in the kitchen exactly, but at its edge, close enough that the warmth from the stove reached him, far enough that he could have claimed he was simply getting some air. He had a piece of leather in his hands that he was mending with a needle and thread, and he looked up when she came in with the particular expression of a man who has been caught doing something innocent and is mildly surprised to find he has to explain it. "Morning," he said. Louise looked at him. She looked at the stool. She looked at the fact that the stove was not yet lit and therefore the warmth he might have been seeking had not existed yet. "Good morning," she said evenly. "Is there something you need?" "No," he said. I wake up early, thought I'd keep out of the bunkhouse. He paused. I can go. Louise considered this for a moment. There was something in his manner that was straightforward without being aggressive, honest without being presumptuous. He did not look at her the way that some of the men had looked at her the previous evening, with the particular kind of calculation that made her adjust the position of her hands near her skillet. "You can stay," she said, "but I'll need that stool when I'm rolling the biscuit dough, so you'll want to move when I say." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went back to his leather work. She lit the stove. She ground the coffee. She began assembling the ingredients for the morning meal, and the kitchen filled with the low, comfortable sounds of work being done in companionable quiet, which is one of the most underrated forms of human intimacy, and had been known to start more than one love story in more places than just the Kansas plains. He moved the stool when she needed it, exactly as promised. He left when the other men began coming in for breakfast, slipping out the back door without fanfare. And the next morning, he was there again. By the end of the first week, his presence on that stool before sunrise had become something Louise was aware of in the same way she was aware of the wind direction and the state of the woodpile. It was a fact of the morning. She did not examine it too closely, but she was conscious of it. She was conscious of the way he occasionally spoke, not often, but when he did, it was something worth hearing. He told her one morning that the flour barrel needed checking because he had seen signs of weevils in the storehouse. He was right. She told him she appreciated the warning, and he just nodded and went back to whatever he had in his hands that morning, and that was that. She began to notice things about him in the way you notice things about people who are present but not clamoring for attention. He was the first man in the crew to thank her at meals, not performatively but quietly and directly, the way a person thanks someone when they actually mean it. He worked harder than the younger men and made considerably less noise about it. He could fix nearly anything mechanical on the ranch, a skill that made Emmett value him enormously, and he did this with the same patient, methodical attention he brought to everything else. She also noticed that he never talked about where he came from. The other men talked about their origins with the enthusiasm of people who had not yet decided whether to be proud or embarrassed by them. Cody talked about Ohio constantly. Pedro talked about Sonora. Even Dix occasionally made grim references to somewhere in East Texas that he seemed to be simultaneously from and fleeing. But Arthur Easton never volunteered anything about himself that predated the Rafter E, and he redirected personal questions with a quiet efficiency that stopped just short of being rude. Louise understood that particular habit. She employed it herself. It was the second week of May when the incident with the rattlesnake occurred, which was entirely not romantic in any way, but which was the first thing that cracked open the careful distance both of them had been maintaining. She had gone to the smokehouse to retrieve a side of salt pork, and the snake was coiled on the floor inside the door in the particular unhurried way that rattlesnakes occupy space when they have decided the territory belongs to them. Louise was not afraid of snakes in the paralyzing sense, but she was alone, and the smokehouse was small, and the snake was between her and the door. She backed up very carefully and said, in a perfectly level voice, "I require some assistance." Arthur Easton appeared from around the corner of the barn, as though he had simply been nearby and waiting for exactly this kind of request. He assessed the situation through the smokehouse door without drama, took the hoe that was leaning against the building's exterior wall, and dealt with the snake in the quick, necessary way of someone who has done it before. "Thank you," Louise said when it was done. "That one was a big one," he observed. "They usually are when they choose the worst possible moment." He looked at her then with something that was almost a smile, not quite, but the terrain around his eyes shifted in a way that qualified. "You weren't afraid," he said. "It was not entirely a question." "I was appropriately concerned," Louise said. "That is different from afraid." This time the almost smile made it fully across his face, brief and genuine, and Louise felt it land somewhere in her chest in the way that certain things land before you have had time to talk yourself out of noticing them. She went back to the kitchen with the salt pork. She did not think about his smile. She focused very deliberately on the salt pork. The weeks settled into a rhythm that felt both temporary and curiously comfortable. Louise fell in love with the physical work of feeding 12 men 3 times a day, the strategy of it, the problem-solving required when supplies ran low, or the weather made delivery impossible, or when she had to make something memorable out of nothing much. She had always believed that cooking was an act of translation, taking the raw materials of the earth and turning them into something that reminded people they were alive and connected and deserving of care. She bartered with a Comanche woman named Tohi, who came to the ranch's back fence on alternating Thursdays with dried herbs and ground corn. And in exchange, Louise gave her baked goods and occasionally bolts of cloth that she convinced Emmett to include in the supply orders. It was a good arrangement and a small illustration of the complicated human geography of the southern Kansas borderlands in 1878, where Anglo ranchers and cattle crews and the indigenous peoples, whose land the cattle were crossing, occupied an uneasy and shifting proximity. Louise noticed the injustice of it, the way that the land that Tohi's people had known for generations was now being parceled and claimed by men with paper deeds, and she felt the weight of it in the transactions they made, the smallness of what she could offer against the scale of what had been taken. She could not fix it. She could not undo the history that had brought the Rafter E into existence on that particular piece of ground. But she could give Tohi good cornbread and look her in the eye when they spoke, and Tohi, whose assessment of people was sharp and immediate, seemed to consider this worth something. It was a warm evening in late May when Arthur finally told her something real about himself. The crew had come in late from driving a cut of cattle to the northern pasture, and supper was later than usual. And by the time the men had eaten and cleared out, the sun had set and the kitchen was lit by the lamp on the table and the low glow of the banked stove. Louise was scrubbing the large pot and Arthur had come back, as he had begun doing on evenings when the work ran long, to carry water from the pump so she did not have to make multiple trips in the dark. "You grew up cooking," he said. It was the kind of statement that was also a question, the kind that opens a door without demanding you walk through it. "My mother taught me," Louise said. "She was good at it, precise." She paused. "She used to say that a recipe was a promise. You follow it right and it keeps its word. That's a good way to think about it." She scrubbed the pot for a moment. "Where did you grow up?" she asked, because she had decided tonight to ask directly, which was a change from her usual habit. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, southern Missouri, a small farm outside of a town called Neosho. "That's a long way from here." "Most places are," he said. "Down the water bucket. My father died when I was 15. After that I worked whatever I could find, ended up going south then west. That was 12 years ago." Louise rinsed the pot and set it to dry. "Do you miss Missouri?" "I miss the idea of it," he said carefully. "The way it was before everything changed, the actual place I left, no." He looked at the lamp flame for a moment. "Do you miss St. Louis?" She had not told him she was from St. Louis. She turned to look at him. "Emmett mentioned it," he said. "Emmett talks considerably more than he appears to," Louise said. She dried her hands on her apron. "I miss my mother. St. Louis was just where we happened to be." He nodded slowly, as though that answer confirmed something he had already suspected. The lamp burned between them, and outside the night insects were singing in the long grass by the creek, and somewhere in the bunkhouse someone was playing a harmonica very badly. "You're good at what you do," Arthur said. "I mean that genuinely, not just the cooking. The way you run this kitchen, the way you handle people." Louise looked at him. She was not accustomed to being spoken to with that particular kind of directness, the kind that was about her competence and not about her appearance or her availability or any of the other things men tended to lead with when they thought they were paying a compliment. "Thank you," she said. "You are also good at what you do, from what I can observe, and considerably more observant than most." He looked slightly surprised by this, as though he had not expected reciprocal notice. It was, Louise thought, a somewhat revealing reaction. He left shortly after, carrying the empty water bucket back to the pump, and Louise stayed in the kitchen for a while after he was gone, not doing anything in particular, just standing in the warm lamplight and thinking about nothing she was quite ready to name. June arrived with heat and a dispute about a fence line that had Emmett riding to town twice in 1 week with a face like thunderclouds. Gerald Rafter came off his porch long enough to have a heated meeting with a neighboring rancher named Hollies, a large, ruddy man who seemed to believe that property lines were suggestions made by people who had not met him yet. The dispute was about a stretch of pasture near the Southern Creek Fork, and while it never came to anything violent, it created a tension over the ranch that everyone felt for about 2 weeks. In the midst of this, Arthur became a fixture of the kitchen in a way that had moved well beyond the morning stool. He began staying after supper most evenings, ostensibly to help with the water or the wood, but in practice simply to be present in the kitchen while Louise worked. They talked. They talked about the books they had read, which turned out to overlap in surprising ways, including a shared appreciation for Mr. Dickens that led to a long argument about which of his novels was superior, an argument Louise won on the grounds of structural coherence, though Arthur made a creditable case for sentiment. They talked about the land, about the cattle business, about the complicated human dramas of ranch life. They talked about food, which Arthur had opinions about that were more developed than she would have expected, having grown up in a house where his mother had apparently been a serious cook. He started bringing things to the kitchen, small things, a handful of wild onions he had found near the creek, a pouch of dried red pepper from his own stores, a Texas habit. Once, memorably, a jar of local honey he had obtained in trade from a beekeeper 3 miles east of the ranch, which Louise used in a batch of tea cakes that caused Cody to eat 7 of them and feel genuinely unwell afterward. "You did not have to bring me honey," Louise said, the evening he produced the jar. "I know," Arthur said. He set it on the work table. "But I thought you'd do something good with it." She looked at him across the work table with its flour dust and the honey jar sitting gold and gleaming between them, and she felt something shift in the space between intention and feeling, the very particular shift that happens when you realize that someone has been paying attention to you in the specific and serious way that changes things. She did not say anything about that. She thanked him for the honey and made the tea cakes, and the evening passed the way evenings in the kitchen had been passing, warm and lamplit and full of quiet conversation, and the shift stayed in the room between them like a thing waiting to be acknowledged. It was Cody who said it out loud first, because Cody was 19 and had not yet developed the filter that life eventually installs in most people. "You know Easton never misses a meal," he said one morning to Louise, while collecting his breakfast plate with the directness of a young man who does not realize he is stating something that the subject of his observation can probably hear through the open door. "I mean, the rest of us miss meals sometimes. Not Easton. He's in here every single meal and half the evenings besides. I told Pedro that if you ever leave, Easton'd probably go with you. Cody," Arthur's voice came through the doorway, perfectly calm, "go check on the horses." Cody went, the particular rapid departure of a young man who has just realized he has walked into the edge of something he did not see coming. Louise, her back to the doorway, carefully continued stirring the oatmeal. A moment of silence. Then Arthur came into the kitchen proper and stood near the work table, and she was acutely aware of him in the way she had become acutely aware of him over the past weeks, the specific physical awareness of someone whose presence had become significant in a way you could no longer pretend was merely friendly. "He's not wrong," Arthur said. Louise set down the spoon. She turned around. "No," she said, "he is not." They looked at each other across the kitchen, and the space between them was full of everything that had been building since April. The early mornings on the stool and the water buckets and the honey jar, and the Dickens arguments and the snake in the smokehouse, and all the evenings that had stretched longer than supper required, because neither of them had been quite ready to break them off. "Louise," he said, and her name in his mouth had a quality she had not heard before, careful and warm and very serious. "Arthur," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, which was actually all it took because it was not a large kitchen, and he stopped close enough that she could see the particular dark brown of his eyes in the morning light, and he said, "I don't have a great deal of pretty things to say. I know that, but I would very much like to court you if you're willing, properly, with your permission." Louise Wells, who had been perfectly sensible and entirely unsentimental for 26 years, and had arrived at the Rafter E with $4 and a skillet and no intention of any such thing, looked at this man who had spent 2 months quietly turning up in her kitchen and bringing her wild onions and honey, and never once making her feel like anything less than exactly what she was. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." He smiled then, a full real smile that changed his entire face, and Louise thought that it was perhaps one of the best things she had ever seen, which was saying something because she had seen a great many beautiful things in her years of careful looking. The summer of 1878 on the Rafter E was the summer Louise Wells fell irrevocably in love, and she did it in the way she did most things, with her whole attention and without half measures. Courting in the context of a working cattle ranch was a practical and occasionally interrupted affair. It happened in the margins of long days, in the half hour before supper when Arthur would come and sit on the kitchen stool that Cody had already begun calling his with the amused authority of someone who has correctly identified a permanent fixture, and they would talk while Louise finished the cooking. It happened on Sunday afternoons when the ranch work slowed, when they would walk along the Bitter Fork Creek and Arthur would show her where the wild plums grew, and she would make a mental note of the location for future preserves. It happened in stolen evening conversations that lasted longer and longer as the summer deepened, until Emmett Crane began giving Arthur a look at supper time that communicated both complete awareness of the situation and a certain philosophical acceptance of it. Arthur took his courting seriously in the same way he took everything seriously, with steadiness and attention. He was not a man of grand theatrical gestures. He did not write poetry, though he told her once that he had tried as a young man in Missouri, and the results had been, in his own assessment, genuinely terrible. What he did was be present. He was present in a way that Louise, who had spent most of her adult life being the most reliable person in any room she occupied, found genuinely new. He remembered things she said. He noticed when she was tired. He learned, without being asked, what she needed from a morning versus what she needed from an evening, and he adjusted himself accordingly with the adaptable intelligence of someone who has spent his life reading situations accurately. He also, gradually, told her more about Missouri, about the farm that had gone under after his father died, about the 2 years he had spent in difficult circumstances in the aftermath, working for men who paid poorly and required the silence of people who had no alternatives, about the slow migration south and west that had eventually brought him to Texas, and then up to Kansas and finally to the Rafter E, where Emmett had hired him 5 years ago and where, he said with a quietness that contained a great deal, he had found the first place that felt something like stable. "You've been running from something," Louise said one Sunday afternoon by the creek. She did not say it as an accusation. She said it the way she said most things, directly and with care. "I was," Arthur said. He was sitting beside her on the creek bank with his boots off and his feet in the water, which was one of the more relaxed things she had seen him do and which she privately found rather charming. "I'm not any more." She looked at the water moving over the rocks and thought about that. "What changed?" He looked at her. "I think you know what changed." Louise looked back at him. The sun was coming through the cottonwood leaves in long shifting bars of light, and the creek made its low, persistent sound, and somewhere a meadowlark was singing. "I do know," she said quietly. He reached out and took her hand. He did it simply, without preamble, his large, weathered hand covering hers where it rested on the bank, and they sat like that for a long time without saying anything more, which was entirely sufficient. The entire crew of the Rafter E had opinions about the courtship, expressed with varying degrees of subtlety. Cody expressed his opinions with zero subtlety whatsoever and a great deal of enthusiasm, frequently congratulating Arthur at random moments, about nothing in particular, with a grin that made Arthur look at the sky in mild exasperation. Pedro was warm and genuinely pleased in the way of someone who enjoys seeing good things happen to people he respects. Dix said nothing, which in Dix's particular emotional vocabulary was the equivalent of a toast and a handshake. Emmett Crane told Louise privately one afternoon, in a conversation that he clearly found somewhat uncomfortable, that Arthur Easton was a good man, and that he had never known him to be anything but reliable and fair, and that he hoped she was happy here, and that the meals had been considerably better than anything the ranch had seen in its history. And then he seemed to feel that he had said enough and excused himself to go look at some fencing. Gerald Rafter, apprised of the situation by Emmett, came off his porch on a Saturday morning and came into the kitchen and stood there for a moment looking at Louise with his old pale eyes. "You plan on staying," he said. "As long as you'll have me," Louise said. He nodded. "Good cook," he said, which was clearly the fullest endorsement he was capable of, and went back to his porch. Louise found that she was happy. It was a strange thing to locate in herself, happiness, like finding a room in a house you thought you had fully mapped. She was happy in the specific ways that the work itself gave her satisfaction, the daily craft of feeding people well, the rhythm of the kitchen seasons, the pleasure of doing something difficult with skill. And she was happy in the new and somewhat overwhelming way of being seen by someone whose seeing she valued. Arthur, for his part, wore his happiness like he wore everything else, without drama but unmistakably. He laughed more than he had in the spring, a sound that Cody claimed could be heard from the barn, and which Pedro declared was good for the horses. He worked with the energy of a man who has found a reason to invest in the future of the particular patch of earth he is standing on. In August, with the summer heat pressing down on the plains and the cattle making their slow business under the wide Kansas sky, Arthur came into the kitchen one morning before sunrise and sat on his stool, and instead of mending leather or doing anything with his hands, he just held a small box that he had clearly had made in Caldwell by someone who worked in simple wood and brass. Louise noticed immediately, because she noticed everything about him now, the way his hands were positioned, and the particular stillness he was holding himself in. She turned from the stove and looked at him. He looked up at her. "This is not a speech," he said. "I'm going to say it plainly because I think you prefer plain." "I do," she said. "I love you, Louise. I have loved you since around the time of the rattlesnake, if I am being precise, though it probably started before that. I want to marry you if you'll have me. I have a wage and a position here, and I have spoken with Mr. Rafter about building onto the kitchen quarters so we'd have proper rooms." He said yes, in case that matters. He paused. "It matters to me that you have a proper place. I know you came here to work and to build something of your own, and I do not want anything I'm offering to take away from that. I want to build it alongside you." Louise stood with her hand resting on the stove and her heart doing something very large and undignified in her chest and her eyes, inconveniently and without her permission, filling with tears that she blinked at firmly. "You spoke with Mr. Rafter about the rooms before you asked me," she observed. "I wanted to have a concrete thing to offer," he said, "not just words." She crossed the kitchen, which was still not very large, and took the small box from his hands and opened it. Inside was a ring, simple and lovely, a narrow band of silver with a small piece of turquoise set in it, the stone a clear deep blue-green that caught the lamplight beautifully. "The turquoise is from a trader in Caldwell," he said. "The woman at the trading post said it was from New Mexico. I thought the color suited you." "It does," Louise said, which was not the primary thing she felt, but was the thing she said first because she was still gathering the larger thing. She looked at the ring and then she looked at him. this man who had arrived in her kitchen before sunrise and stayed, who had brought her wild onions and honey, who had learned how she needed her mornings and respected the way she worked, who had told her his history with the careful honesty of someone who had decided she was worth that risk. "Yes," she said. "Arthur Easton, yes. Emphatically and without reservation, yes." He stood up and she was still holding the ring box, and he put his hands on her face, very gently, the way he did everything, with a care that felt like the opposite of carelessness, and he kissed her. And outside, the bitter Fork Creek was moving over its stones in the early dark, and somewhere the first birds were beginning to consider the dawn. And it was, Louise thought, exactly the right way for everything important to begin. They were married in September 1878 in Caldwell at the Methodist Church, which was a modest building that had been constructed with more enthusiasm than expertise, but had genuine windows and a proper bell. It was a small wedding by the standards of anyone who had excess, and a fine wedding by the standards of two people who had each other, and a collection of rough-edged cowboys who cleaned up with considerable effort and varying success. Cody cried. He denied this afterward with great vehemence, and everyone present had the grace to pretend to believe him. Pedro played guitar at the celebration afterward, and it turned out he was genuinely gifted at it. And the music went on long into the evening under the big Kansas sky, while the crew of the Rafter E ate the food that Louise had spent 2 days preparing for the occasion, and drank Emmett's carefully rationed whiskey. Louise wore a dress she had made herself from blue calico, the best blue she could find in Caldwell's dry goods store, and she wore the turquoise ring on her finger, and she felt, in the plain and unambiguous way of things that are true, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Gerald Rafter attended the wedding and sat in the front pew, and at the celebration afterward produced, without advance warning, a bottle of genuine French brandy that he said he had been saving for a significant occasion and had begun to suspect there would never be one. He raised a glass to them with the brevity of a man who does not do speeches and the weight of someone who means what he says, and it was, Louise thought, one of the more moving toasts she had ever witnessed. The rooms Arthur had arranged were built in October by Arthur himself and 2 other hands, added to the eastern wall of the kitchen building, solid and warm and properly chinked against the winter wind. They were not large, but they had a real window that faced the creek and a proper door with a latch, and Arthur built a shelf along one wall that Louise immediately filled with her collection of cooking references and the few books she owned. And by the time the Kansas winter arrived in earnest, the rooms felt like home in the deep and genuine sense, the sense of a place that has been made rather than simply occupied. The winter of 1878 going into 1879 was cold in the way that Kansas winters are cold, comprehensively and without sentiment. But the kitchen was warm, and the work was constant, and the evenings were long and private in the way that winter evenings in small rooms become private, full of the domestic intimacy of 2 people learning the close geography of sharing a life. Arthur was a better partner than Louise had known how to ask for, partly because she had not known she was allowed to ask. He did not expect her to be anything other than what she was. He did not diminish her competence or her opinions or her particular brand of quiet ferocity. When she was tired, he cooked, producing meals of modest ambition and genuine effort that she ate without mockery and with honest appreciation. When she was frustrated with the limits of the life she could build in this particular time and place as a woman, he listened, and he did not tell her that she ought not to feel what she felt, which was more than she had expected from most people. She talked to him about her mother that winter properly, more than she had talked about her mother to anyone. About what she had been like and what she had taught and what she had left, the unpaid bills and the rented room, but also the real things, the knowledge of how to feed people well, the understanding that work done with care is not diminished by being humble work, the conviction that a woman's worth is not a calculation made by anyone else. Arthur listened to all of it. He asked good questions. He told her that her mother sounded like someone he wished he had been able to meet. By February, Louise knew she was carrying their child. She told Arthur on a Sunday morning when the snow was coming down outside the kitchen window in the slow, heavy flakes of a real winter storm, and the stove was burning hard and the room was warm and he was sitting across the small table from her with his coffee. He went very still in the way he went still when something important was happening, the way he had gone still holding the ring box in August. "Truly," he said. "Truly," she said. He reached across the table and took both her hands and held them, and he did not say a great deal, because Arthur Easton was not a man of a great deal of words when words were insufficient to the moment. And this was one of those moments. And they sat like that in the warm kitchen with the snow falling and the stove ticking and the whole winter world outside going white and quiet. The spring of 1879 brought the thaw and the first cattle drives of the season, and the news that Gerald Rafter, who had been failing slowly through the winter in the way of old men who have decided they are finished, had passed away quietly one March night in his chair, which was where he had always said he intended to go. He left the ranch to Emmett with instructions, documented in a proper legal document that turned out to have been arranged with more foresight than anyone had suspected, that Emmett was to maintain the current crew for at least 2 years, and that the cook was to be kept on with full wages regardless of any other changes. "Kept on," Louise said, when Emmett told her this. Emmett's mustache twitched. Those were his words. He was not a man who wasted them. "No," Louise said. "He was not." She felt the loss of Gerald Rafter more than she expected, the loss of his cranky economy of expression and his bottle of French brandy and the nod he had given her on that first afternoon that had contained, she understood now, more genuine welcome than most people had offered her in her life. Emmett Rafter, as the ranch's new owner, ran it much as he had always run it because he was, at his core, a man who recognized what worked and left it alone. The crew remained largely the same through that spring, though a new hand named Samuel joined them in April, a young man from Georgia who was quietly courteous and very homesick, and who Louise fed with the particular attentiveness she gave to people who were in the process of finding their footing. Louise's pregnancy was progressing through the spring and into the summer, and she continued working in the kitchen with the pragmatic adaptation of a woman who does not consider her condition a reason to stop being useful, though Arthur drew lines that she respected, which is to say that she agreed they were reasonable lines because she had drawn them herself already. She did not lift the heaviest pots. She took the afternoon rest he asked her to take because her back required it, and her body was occasionally unreasonable about what it wanted. She accepted help from the other women, of which there were now 2 in the vicinity, the wife of a neighboring small farmer named Mrs. Hale who came by on Thursdays, and Tohi, who arrived one morning in June with a collection of herbs and a manner of matter-of-fact knowledge that Louise received with gratitude and without awkwardness. Arthur hovered. He did not hover in the obtrusive way of men who make their anxiety into a demand on the people they love, but in the careful, attentive way of someone who has decided that paying attention is the most useful thing he can do, and he was right, and Louise told him so. "You are managing very well," he told her one evening in June, watching her finish the supper prep from the doorway because she had briefly banned him from the kitchen on the grounds that he was getting underfoot, which was not entirely fair but was the kind of claim that goes uncontested when made by a heavily pregnant woman. "I am managing adequately," Louise said. "Well is next month." He laughed, and she liked the sound of it more every time she heard it. Their son was born in July of 1879, on a hot night when the prairie wind was doing nothing useful and the midwife from Caldwell, a capable woman named Mrs. Garrett, had ridden out that afternoon with the calm professional air of someone who has seen everything and been surprised by very little. Arthur waited outside the rooms through the whole of it, which Mrs. Garrett enforced with the authority of someone accustomed to ejecting anxious husbands from their own homes. And Louise had to admit later that this was probably wise, because she had heard him pacing through the wall, and the pacing had been genuinely very fast. When it was over and Mrs. Garrett came to the door and said, "You have a son," Arthur made a sound that Louise heard clearly even from the bed, where she was exhausted and aching and holding the most remarkable thing she had ever seen. A sound that was not quite a word, just a sound that contained everything relief and joy can be when they arrive at the same time. He came in and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched the expression on Arthur Easton's face and thought that she would remember it for the rest of her life. The way his entire face did something she had no good word for, something about wonder and gravity and love so large it had no edge she could find. "He has your eyes," Arthur said. "He has your stubbornness," Louise said. "He took his time deciding to arrive." "He's perfect," Arthur said. And the word was so uncharacteristic and so genuine that Louise felt her eyes go treacherous again, which she permitted on this occasion. They named him James Harold Easton, James for Louise's father whom she had never known and Harold for Arthur's own father. And from the very first morning he was in the kitchen, held in the makeshift cradle Arthur built from the leftover wood of the room addition, and positioned where Louise could see him while she worked. Cody held the baby on the second day with the reverent terror of someone handling a very delicate and probably explosive object, and proclaimed James the best baby he had ever seen, though Louise strongly suspected James was the only baby Cody had ever held, which she kept to herself. The autumn of 1879 settled over the Rafter E with the beautiful decisive quality of a Kansas fall, the grass going gold, and the sky going the hard, brilliant blue that the plains only produce in October, the cattle growing their winter coats, and the work shifting into the particular rhythms of the pre-winter season. Louise had returned to the full work of the kitchen with James in his cradle, and eventually in a carrier, that Tohi helped her construct according to a design that was practically superior to anything else available, because Tohi was an exceptionally practical person. The crew ate their meals and cooed periodically at James with the collective awkward warmth of 12 grown men encountering a small baby in their midst, and James, who was proving to have the equable temperament of someone accustomed to being surrounded by large, noisy people, tolerated this with apparent good humor. Arthur finished the day's work and came to the kitchen and held his son in the evenings while Louise finished the supper cleanup, which had become one of the domestic rituals she found she loved most, the lamp burning and the stove cooling and the sound of Arthur talking quietly to James about whatever was in his mind, the cattle and the weather and the state of the fence in the south pasture, and once, memorably and at length, Mr. Dickens, which was either the most or least appropriate subject for a 4-month-old depending on your point of view. "You know he cannot understand you," Louise said. "He'll get used to the sound of good conversation," Arthur said. "That seems important." Louise smiled at her supper pot and did not argue with this because she agreed with it. There were difficulties, as there are in any honest account of a life. There was a hard winter that followed that golden autumn, harder than the previous one, with weeks of genuine cold that tested the buildings and the livestock and the patience of everyone. There was a dispute between Emmett and a cattle buyer from Wichita that cost the ranch a significant contract and created a leaner spring than anyone had planned for, and Louise spent several weeks in creative problem-solving with the food budget that was genuinely taxing, but which she managed because managing was what she did. There was an evening in that lean spring when Arthur came in from a long and difficult day in which one of the horses had broken a leg and had to be put down, a horse he had worked with for 3 years, and he sat at the kitchen table while Louise put James to bed, and he did not speak for a long time, and when she sat across from him and put her hand over his on the table, he eventually talked about it, about the horse and about what it reminded him of. The losses that accumulate in the kind of life he had lived, the things let go, the people, the places, the version of yourself that existed before you learned to expect less. You don't have to expect less anymore, Louise said. That was then. He turned his hand over and held hers. I know, he said. That's what I'm still learning to know. There was the ongoing reality of the land and its complicated human history, the fact that the range was shrinking as settlers came and fenced it, the fact that the people who had lived on that land before any fence existed were being pressed further and further into corners by forces that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with power. Tohi stopped coming to the back fence in the late spring of 1880, and Louise did not know what had happened to her, whether she had moved on or been moved on, and the not knowing sat in her like a stone. She mentioned it to Arthur, and he listened and did not offer false comfort, because he understood the landscape well enough to know that false comfort would have been an insult. The world is being remade out here, he said quietly, and not always in ways that are right. Almost never in ways that are right, Louise said, and he did not disagree. But through the difficulties, the thread of what they had built together held. Louise understood, in the accumulating way of people who are paying attention to their lives, that this was what love was in its most durable form, not the feeling that had arrived like a struck match in the kitchen in April 1878, though that had been real and necessary, but the sustained choosing of each other through all the conditions that tested it, the hard winters and the lean springs and the evenings when grief came in and sat down at the table and had to be lived with rather than solved. They were good at that. Both of them, people who had learned early that life does not guarantee comfort, who had each built their own form of endurance before they found each other, had come together in a way that made them stronger at the broken places rather than weaker. By the summer of 1880, James was 1 year old and walking, which meant that the kitchen had taken on an additional supervisory dimension that Louise managed with the efficiency of someone who has always been able to do several things at once. James had Arthur's dark eyes and Louise's exact specific stubbornness, and an appetite that made every member of the crew declare him a future champion of something, though opinions differed on what. It was in the summer of 1880 that Emmett Crane, who had been quietly corresponding with a widow in Caldwell named Agnes for the better part of a year, announced that he intended to marry her and bring her to live at the ranch. The announcement was made at the supper table with the particular gruffness of a man who has decided that vulnerability might as well be got over with quickly, and the response from the crew was enthusiastic, if somewhat chaotic. Agnes arrived in August, a sturdy, good-humored woman of 45 who took one look at the Rafter E Ranch, one look at Emmett's mustache, and one look at Louise in her kitchen, and declared that she thought she was going to be very happy here. Louise liked her immediately with the specific warmth she reserved for capable women who assessed situations accurately. Having Agnes at the ranch changed things in good ways. There was company in the domestic sphere that Louise had not known she was missing, another woman with whom to share the labor and the conversation, and the particular knowledge that women in that era traded with the seriousness of people who understood that shared knowledge was survival. Agnes had skills with herbs, and preserving that supplemented Louise's cooking. Louise had organizational capabilities that helped Agnes manage the chaos of running a household for 12 working men. They worked together in the kitchen with the easy efficiency of people who have agreed on the purpose of things, and leave the arguing for areas that actually require it. The autumn of 1880 was, by most measures, the best autumn yet on the Rafter E. The cattle sale went well. The weather cooperated. The food was exceptional, Louise and Agnes having developed a complementary style that resulted in meals the crew talked about with an enthusiasm that Emmett occasionally referred to, with the cautious diplomacy of a man who does not want to make anyone feel like a competition is occurring, as a significant improvement across the board. Arthur, watching Louise one October evening in the kitchen as she and Agnes put up the last of the apple preserves, James asleep in his cradle, and the whole room smelling of cinnamon and cooked fruit, felt the particular fullness of a man who has arrived somewhere he had not expected to reach. He had not expected, at 29 years old and 12 years removed from the Missouri farm and all the hard road in between, to find himself standing in a kitchen on the Kansas plains watching his wife work, with the efficient satisfaction of someone who has built a life she means, with his son sleeping 5 feet away, and the smell of everything good in the air. He had not expected it, and he had it, and he understood clearly that it was the most important thing he had ever been given and the thing he would spend every remaining day of his life deserving. Louise looked up and found him watching her. She raised an eyebrow. "You have a look on your face," she said. "What kind of look?" he asked. "The kind that means you are thinking something large and not saying it." Agnes, with the gracious tact of a woman who knows when two people need to be alone, suddenly discovered she needed to check on something in the other room. Arthur came across the kitchen and stood close to her, and Louise looked up at him with the flour on her hands and the apple smell in the air and the lamplight making everything amber and warm, and he put his hands on her face the way he had in the kitchen 2 years ago, the gentle, careful way, and he said, "I was thinking that I'm a fortunate man." "You are," Louise agreed. "I'm also a fortunate woman." "Do you regret any of it?" he asked. It was an honest question, asked without performance. She looked at him steadily, this man who had been on her kitchen stool before she lit the stove on the second morning, who had brought honey and wild onions, who had asked her permission before anything, who had built rooms and married her and held their son and stayed through every difficult thing with the same reliable presence. "Not a moment," she said. He kissed her forehead, and then properly, and James slept undisturbed in his cradle, and Agnes returned from her invented errand with perfect timing after a sufficient interval, and the evening finished with the 4 of them and the lamplight and the smell of apple preserves, which was as fine an ending as any evening on the Kansas plains had ever produced. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was mild by comparison with previous years, a grace that everyone appreciated with the particular gratitude of people who have known bad winters and do not take mild ones for granted. James learned to talk in that winter, first in fragments and then in the rushing tumble of words that small children produce when language becomes available to them, and he applied his new capability to everything in his environment with the exhaustive thoroughness of someone cataloging the world. "Horse," he said of the horses. "Dicks," he said of Dicks, pointing with great accuracy. "Beans," he said at supper, with a degree of enthusiasm that Louise found genuinely gratifying. And "Papa," which he said with the particular volume and frequency of someone who has discovered that this word produces a very satisfying response in the large man, who appears to find the production of it extremely pleasing. Dix, who had maintained his communicative minimalism through all of this, said, "That boy talks a lot," one February morning, which in the context of 2 years of virtual silence from Dix was practically a declaration of affection, and which made Cody nearly fall off his bench laughing. In the spring of 1881, Louise discovered she was expecting their second child, and this time she told Arthur in the kitchen in the early morning on his stool, before the stove was properly lit, because it seemed right to tell him there where everything important between them had begun. He was quiet the same way he had been quiet the first time, that very still particular quality, and then he looked at her and said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "Good," he said, and smiled, and it was the same smile she had first seen after the rattlesnake, the one that changed his whole face, and 3 years had not diminished it by any measure. The second pregnancy was easier in some ways and harder in others. James was now old enough to be an active participant in the kitchen in ways that were sometimes helpful and frequently not, and managing both a toddler and a pregnancy, while maintaining the full operations of a kitchen for 12 men, was a logistical challenge that Louise solved primarily through the combination of her own considerable capability and Agnes's unfailing support, and the remarkably willing assistance of Samuel, the young man from Georgia, who had grown into an excellent ranch hand and who turned out to be extraordinarily good with small children, a skill he attributed to being the eldest of 7 siblings. Arthur worked on an addition to their rooms through the summer, a second room for the coming baby, built with the same careful attention he brought to everything structural. He worked in the evenings after the day's ranch work was finished, and sometimes Louise would sit in the doorway of the existing rooms with James in her lap and watch him work in the long summer light, and she would think that this particular image, this man building a room for a child coming, in the golden evening light of the Kansas plains, was one of the things she would want to carry forward into every remaining year of her life. The baby came in September of 1881, a girl this time, born on a clear autumn morning when the air was already beginning to smell of the approaching season change, and Mrs. Garrett was there again with her capable manner and her no-nonsense approach to the whole proceeding. Louise held her daughter and thought she was the most beautiful thing in a world that had recently been producing quite a lot of beautiful things. They named her Clara Rose Easton, Clara for Agnes, who received this news with a degree of emotion she managed by going directly to the kitchen and beginning to bake, and Rose for the wild prairie roses that grew along the Bitter Fork in early summer. Arthur held Clara the same way he had held James, with that quality of wonder that Louise had decided was one of the things she loved best about him, the capacity for wonder not diminished by repetition, the genuine astonishment of a man who understands that remarkable things deserve to be recognized as remarkable every time. James regarded his sister with the complex and shifting assessments of a 2-year-old encountering competition, and the crew of the Rafter E received the news of her arrival with the enthusiastic warmth of people who have collectively decided that the Easton family's expansions are something they have a stake in. Cody, predictably, cried. He denied this again with equal vigor. The years that followed were the building years, the years in which the life Louise and Arthur had started in the kitchen of the Rafter E deepened and filled in and became the specific and particular shape that a life takes when the people living it know what they value and work toward it with honesty. James grew into a serious-faced boy who had his mother's observational precision and his father's patience, and who asked questions about everything with the thoroughness of someone who intends to understand the world rather than simply inhabit it. Clara grew into a child of enormous energy and strong opinions who was afraid of nothing, and had decided by the age of 2 that the kitchen was the center of the known universe, and that she intended to master it, which Louise found both professionally flattering and logistically challenging. Louise's reputation as a cook extended, as good reputations do, outward from the source. Women in Caldwell and the surrounding area began seeking her out for advice on preserving and baking, and the management of wood stove cooking in the variable Kansas climate. She taught freely, because she had been taught freely, and understood that knowledge was not diminished by being shared. She began writing things down, the recipes and the techniques and the practical wisdom of years of working at the intersection of scarcity and necessity, in a series of notebooks that she kept on the shelf Arthur had built beside her books, and which Clara, by the age of 4, had decided were her inheritance. Arthur continued to be the most reliable person on the Rafter E, a fact that Emmett acknowledged openly, and which the rotating cast of newer ranch hands learned quickly. He had become, over the years, something of an institution in the practical sense, the man who knew where everything was and how everything worked, and who could tell you what to do in almost any situation involving cattle, horses, fencing, machinery, or weather. He had also, more quietly, become the kind of man in the community who could be trusted to give a fair assessment of any dispute, which meant that people occasionally came to him with things that had nothing to do with the ranch, and he handled these with the same even attention he brought to everything. They built a garden in the spring of 1882, proper and substantial, behind the kitchen building in the patch of ground that got the best southern exposure. Louise had wanted a garden since she arrived, and the combination of 3.5 years of establishment and the specific pride of ownership that comes from having built something from nothing made it feel like the right time. Arthur broke the ground and built the raised beds and helped her plant, and James crouched in the dirt beside them, both with the dedicated interest of a small person who has concluded that dirt is excellent. And Clara, not yet mobile enough to participate, watched from the blanket Agnes had spread in the sun with an expression of focused intention that suggested she was cataloging the information for future use. The garden was a good garden. Tomatoes, beans, squash, onions, herbs, melons, and corn. A proper productive plot that changed the kitchen's summer and autumn meals in ways the entire crew noticed and appreciated. Dix ate an entire bowl of tomatoes one August evening with the expression of someone experiencing something transformative and said, "Good tomatoes," which was the longest single-subject endorsement anyone had ever heard from him, and which Cody made a serious attempt to commemorate by carving something on the barn wall that Emmett made him sand off. By 1883, the Rafter E was a different place than the one Louise had arrived at in April 1878. Not unrecognizable, but evolved in the way that places evolve when the people in them commit to them, when the work is done with care, and the changes are made thoughtfully, and the community that forms around a piece of land decides to be a community, rather than just a collection of people who happen to share proximity. Emmett and Agnes had settled into the particular comfort of a late-in-life marriage that suits both people exactly, which is rarer and more valuable than people who have not experienced it tend to understand. Cody, who was now 24 and no longer quite as comprehensively guileless as he had been at 19, had taken on a leadership role among the younger hands with the warm authority of someone who has grown into himself. Pedro had gone back to Sonora the previous year to be with his aging mother, and they had all missed him, and he had written once, a letter that Emmett translated with help from a woman in Caldwell, saying that he thought of the Rafter E and wished them well, and that the cooking there had been the best he had known outside his mother's kitchen. Samuel from Georgia had married a woman from Caldwell named Mary, and they were building a small house on land he had saved to purchase 3 miles east of the ranch, and he was still working as a hand, while the house went up and spending his evenings there, a man in the process of rooting himself in a place which Louise recognized and appreciated. Dix was still there, unchanged, apparently indestructible, communicating primarily through expressions and the occasional word, eating everything placed before him with the steady appreciation of someone who has never once taken a meal for granted. Louise stood in her kitchen one morning in the fall of 1883, the October light coming through the window she had always loved for the way it shifted through the day. James at the table doing his lessons with the schoolbook Emmett had ordered from Caldwell, Clara attempting to roll biscuit dough on the corner of the work table with more enthusiasm than precision, and Arthur at the doorway with his coffee in his hand, and the ranch visible behind him in the clear autumn morning. 5 years since she had arrived with $4 and a skillet. 5 years since she had taken the posting off the board outside the land office and gone to find Emmett Crane with the practical determination of a woman who knows what she needs and goes after it without waiting for someone to give her permission. She had come for a wage and a roof. She had found those things, and she had also found in the warm lamplight of an early morning kitchen a man who had sat on a stool before the stove was lit and stayed, who had brought honey and wild onions and a turquoise ring, who had built rooms and a garden and held their children with that quality of wonder that she hoped never left him. She had found in the specific and unplannable way that the best things arrive, a life that was entirely her own. Arthur caught her looking at him and raised his coffee cup slightly, a small gesture, just for her, the kind of wordless thing that 5 years of shared mornings produces, and she smiled at him across the kitchen, across the biscuit dough and the spelling lesson and the October light, and he smiled back. "Papa," said Clara, not looking up from the biscuit dough, which she had now transformed into a shape of considerable ambiguity. "Is this a good biscuit?" Arthur came fully into the kitchen and crouched down beside her and looked at the biscuit with great seriousness. "That," he said, "is an exceptional biscuit." Clara looked at it. "Mama," she said, "Papa says it is exceptional." Louise looked at the biscuit. She looked at her daughter's flour-dusted face and her husband's crouched figure and her son at the table who had looked up from his spelling to observe the biscuit assessment with the judicial air of someone who eats a great many biscuits and has developed opinions about them. "He is right," Louise said. "It is exceptional." James went back to his spelling. Clara began rolling the biscuit dough again, with renewed confidence. Arthur stood and came to stand beside Louise at the stove, and she leaned very slightly against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders with the easy naturalness of 5 years of this, of standing together in this kitchen that was the center of everything. Outside, the October wind moved across the Kansas plains, and the bitter Fork Creek made its low sound, and the cattle moved in the far pasture under the brilliant autumn sky. And inside the kitchen of the Rafter E, the stove was warm and the biscuits were going in, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be. They stayed, both of them. They stayed in the kitchen, and in the life they had built from a posting on a sun-bleached board and a cast-iron skillet, and a man on a stool before the stove was lit. And they stayed in the way of people who have looked clearly at what they have and understood its value, who have come through the difficult things still standing and have found each other still standing too, who have decided that this particular patch of earth and this particular person and this particular life, imperfect and ongoing and entirely real, is the thing worth staying for. And if you had asked Louise Wells Easton in the fall of 1883, 5 years on from that first meal that had silenced a room full of rough-edged cowboys and caused one quiet man at the far end of the table to look up and find her in the kitchen doorway with those steady dark eyes, she would have told you without any sentiment she had not earned that she would not change a single morning of it. Not the $4.32, not the skillet, not the rattlesnake, even. Not the honey or the wild onions or the lamplight or the stool or any of the long warm evenings in a kitchen that had been hers before it was theirs, and was better for being both. She would not change a single morning, and there were, God willing, a great many mornings yet to come. In the spring of 1884, when the prairie roses came back to the Bitter Fork as they always did, Louise planted a cutting of them in the garden, because some things deserve to be tended deliberately, and because Clara had asked for roses of her own, and because the woman who had arrived in Caldwell with a skillet and the particular quiet determination of someone who has decided that circumstances do not define her ceiling had learned, in 5 years of building, that the best things you plant with intention are the ones that stay. James helped dig the hole. Clara handed tools with great authority. Arthur held the cutting steady while Louise packed the earth around the roots, and the morning was warm and the sky was the hard, brilliant blue of a Kansas spring, and the whole ranch was coming back to life the way it did every year, reliable as the season itself. "Will they come back every year?" James asked, crouching in the garden dirt. "They will," Louise said, "even if it's a hard winter." "Even then," she said, "that is the thing about roses, they come back." Arthur looked at her over the children's heads, and she looked back, and they understood each other completely, the way people do who have been paying attention to each other through all the seasons, the way people do who have been each other's reference point through the difficult years, and the good ones, and the ones that were simply the ordinary days of a life being lived with honesty and care. The roses took hold and grew, and the garden flourished, and the kitchen of the Rafter E stayed warm through every winter that followed, and Louise Wells Easton cooked for the Rafter E for many years after, feeding people with the intention and craft her mother had taught her. And Arthur Easton never once stopped coming to her kitchen, Not in the early mornings when the stove was not yet lit. Not in the evenings when the day's work was done. Not in any of the seasons that came and went over the Kansas plains. He had found in a kitchen doorway in April of 1878 the one place he always wanted to be, and the woman who stood in it, and he had stayed, in the full and permanent and entirely deliberate way of a man who knows exactly what he has found and has the good sense to remain. And that, in the end, was the whole of it and the best of it, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.